The dusty train platform of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, 1878, baked under a merciless summer sun as Elizabeth Foster stood alone among her trunks and valises, the cruel reality of her situation settling over her like the fine layer of dust that coated everything in this frontier town. At 32, she had traveled halfway across the country to marry a man who had decided, upon seeing her step off the train, that she was too old after all, leaving her stranded with nothing but a hastily scribbled note and the curious stares of strangers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elizabeth smoothed her travel-worn skirt with trembling hands, fighting back tears that threatened to betray her composure. She had left her position as a schoolteacher in Philadelphia, sold nearly everything she owned, and traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a man she had corresponded with for 8 months, only to discover that Harold Williams was not the honorable man his letters had suggested. "Appears someone's been left high and dry," came a deep voice from behind her. Elizabeth turned, squinting against the sun to see a tall figure approaching. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work and open spaces, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the golden afternoon light. As he drew closer, she could make out a strong jawline shadowed with stubble beneath the brim of a well-worn Stetson. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sir," Elizabeth replied, straightening her spine and lifting her chin despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Mason Gray," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed at odds with the trail dust on his clothes and the calluses evident on his outstretched hand. "Own the Double G Ranch about 10 miles outside of town." Elizabeth hesitated before accepting his handshake. Elizabeth Foster. Recently, of Philadelphia. Mason's eyes, a striking shade of green that reminded Elizabeth of the forest creeks back home, assessed her shrewdly. "And recently abandoned, if town gossip travels as fast as usual." Heat flooded her cheeks. "News certainly travels quickly in Cedar Ridge." "Small towns," Mason shrugged. "Not much happens without everyone knowing." He glanced at her substantial luggage. "Harold Williams isn't known for his reliability, or his common sense, apparently." Elizabeth looked away, unable to bear the pity she feared she might see in his eyes. "Yes, well, I've learned that lesson rather too late, I'm afraid." "What will you do now?" Mason asked, his directness catching her off guard. Elizabeth faltered. She had no ready answer. Her savings had been spent on the journey west, and the trousseau she'd believed she needed for her new life. The small town's only hotel was beyond her limited means for more than a night or two. "I haven't yet decided." Mason Gray studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Elizabeth's astonishment, he said, "Marry me today." Elizabeth was certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon." "Marry me," Mason repeated, his voice steady and sure. "I need a wife. You need a home." Seems straightforward enough. "Mr. Gray, we've only just met," Elizabeth protested, wondering if the heat had affected his faculties. "This is hardly appropriate." "Miss Foster," he replied, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "nothing about your situation is appropriate, but I'm offering you a solution." "A solution?" "Sir, marriage is not a business transaction." "Isn't it?" Mason countered. "You came all this way to marry a man you knew only through letters. At least with me, what you see is what you get." Elizabeth felt her temper rise. "And what exactly would I be getting, Mr. Gray?" "A home," he said simply. "Work that matters. My name and protection. And I won't abandon you because of something as ridiculous as your age." "How very gallant," Elizabeth replied, unable to keep the sarcasm from her voice despite her desperate circumstances. Mason's expression softened. "Look, Miss Foster, I've got a ranch that's growing and a 6-year-old daughter who needs a mother. I've been looking for a wife with education and good sense. You're clearly educated, and you've got enough sense to be wary of my offer. That's a start." "A daughter?" Elizabeth hadn't expected that. Mason nodded. "Emma, smart as a whip and twice as stubborn." Been trying to raise her on my own since her mother passed in childbirth. Something in his voice, a note of vulnerability beneath the confidence, made Elizabeth pause. Mr. Gray, while I appreciate your unusual offer, surely you understand why I can't simply agree to marry a complete stranger. Completely understandable, he agreed, surprising her again. Which is why I propose this. Come back to the ranch with me. Meet Emma. See the place. Give it 3 days. If at the end of that time you want to leave, I'll bring you back to town myself with enough money for a ticket east. Elizabeth considered his proposal. It was improper by any standard of decorum she knew, and yet what choice did she have? Her practical options were severely limited, and this man, this stranger, was offering her a chance at the life she had come west seeking, albeit in a very different form than she had imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And if I were to agree to this trial period, she said carefully, what would be expected of me? Help with Emma. Maybe teach her a bit. She's been learning from books and ranch hands, which isn't ideal. Help Mrs. Abernathy, our housekeeper, with running the house. That's all. You'd have your own room, and my word that you'll be treated with respect. Elizabeth looked around the empty platform, at the dusty Main Street beyond, and then back at Mason Gray. His proposal was outlandish, improper, and possibly her only viable option. 3 days, she said finally, and I make no promises beyond that. The ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. Fair enough. Within the hour, Elizabeth found herself seated beside Mason Gray in a wagon loaded with her belongings heading away from Cedar Ridge and into the unknown. The landscape stretched before them, vast and beautiful in its wild way. Rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Have you always lived in Colorado, Mr. Gray? Elizabeth asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Born in Kentucky, he replied, his eyes on the road ahead. Came west after the war. Worked cattle drives for a few years before winning the land that became Double G in a poker game. You won your ranch in a card game? Elizabeth couldn't hide her surprise. Mason's chuckle was low and warm. Not exactly the refined origin story you were hoping for? I wasn't hoping for anything in particular, Elizabeth demurred, though in truth she had been. The land was good but neglected, Mason continued. Built it up over the last 8 years. Now it's one of the most prosperous spreads in the territory. Elizabeth nodded, taking in this information. And Emma's mother? If you don't mind my asking. Mason's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Clara. She was a singer at a saloon in Denver. Beautiful voice. We married quick. Too quick, probably. She wasn't cut out for ranch life, but she tried. Pregnancy was hard on her. The birth. He shook his head. Doctor said there was nothing to be done. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said softly. Emma never knew her. Mason continued after a moment. Just me and Mrs. Abernathy raising her. She deserves better than that. Children are resilient, Elizabeth offered, thinking of her pupils back in Philadelphia. With love and stability, they can thrive in many different circumstances. Mason glanced at her. You sound like you know something about it. I was a teacher, Elizabeth explained. 8 years, with children ranging from 5 to 16. That experience will serve you well with Emma, Mason said, his tone approving. She's bright but headstrong. Needs someone who can channel that energy. If I decide to stay, Elizabeth reminded him. Mason nodded. If you decide to stay. They crested a hill, and Mason pulled the wagon to a stop. There it is. Double G Ranch. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Spread before them was a valley cradled by gentle hills, a creek winding through its center like a silver ribbon. The ranch house was substantial. 2 stories of sturdy timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Nearby stood a large barn, corrals, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings. Fields of hay stretched to the east, while cattle grazed on the hillsides. It was, Elizabeth had to admit, impressive. It's beautiful, she said honestly. It's home. Mason replied simply. a note of pride in his voice. He flicked the reins, and the horses began the descent toward the ranch. As they approached, Elizabeth spotted a small figure racing from the house. A little girl with wild brown curls tumbling from beneath a boy's cap came to a skidding halt beside the wagon as Mason brought it to a stop in the yard. "You're back early?" the child exclaimed, her eyes widening as she noticed Elizabeth. "Who's she?" "Emma," Mason said with a hint of warning in his tone. "This is Miss Foster. She'll be staying with us for a few days." Emma's eyes, the same striking green as her father's, studied Elizabeth with undisguised curiosity. "Are you going to be my new mother?" "Emma!" Mason exclaimed, but Elizabeth laughed, surprising herself. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "Your father has offered me a position here, and we're taking a few days to see if it might suit us both." Emma considered this. "Can you read?" "Very well," Elizabeth confirmed. "Can you bake cookies?" "When necessary." "Do you know multiplication tables?" "Up to 20. Emma's eyes widened. 20? Pa only knows up to 12. Mason cleared his throat. "That's enough questions for now, Emma. Why don't you go tell Mrs. Abernathy we have a guest?" The girl dashed off toward the house, and Mason turned to Elizabeth with an apologetic expression. "She's not one for social graces." "She's delightful," Elizabeth said, finding that she meant it. "Direct, but delightful." Mason helped Elizabeth down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, which she quickly dismissed as a reaction to the kindness he had shown when she most needed it. As they approached the house, a stout woman with iron-gray hair appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Abernathy," Elizabeth presumed, and her suspicion was confirmed when Mason made the introductions. "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Elizabeth Foster. She'll be staying with us for a few days." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but she offered a welcoming smile. "Any friend of Mr. Gray's is welcome here. I've prepared the blue room. Emma, stop hovering and show Miss Foster upstairs." Elizabeth followed the excited child into the house, pleasantly surprised by the interior. While the outside was purely functional, the inside revealed touches of comfort and even beauty. Polished wood floors partially covered with colorful rugs, well-crafted furniture, landscape paintings on the walls, and bookshelves filled with volumes that suggested a love of reading. "This is your room," Emma announced, pushing open a door on the second floor. "It's the prettiest one. Pa says it was my mama's favorite because of the morning light." Elizabeth stepped into a spacious bedroom, painted a soft blue. A large bed with a handmade quilt dominated one wall, while a window seat looked out over the valley. Fresh wildflowers stood in a vase on the dresser. "It's lovely," Elizabeth said, genuinely touched by the care that had been taken. "Mrs. Abernathy put the flowers," Emma informed her. "She said a lady would appreciate them. Do you?" "Very much," Elizabeth confirmed. Emma nodded, satisfied. "Good. I helped pick them. Will you read to me later? Pa tries, but he gets tired after one story." Elizabeth smiled at the child's forthright manner. "Perhaps after dinner, if your father approves." "He will," Emma stated with complete confidence. "He wants me to learn things. That's probably why he brought you home." The casual way Emma stated this gave Elizabeth pause. Had Mason truly been seeking a mother for his daughter and a teacher, rather than just offering help to a woman in distress? Or perhaps both motivations were at play. After Emma left, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of her circumstances. 24 hours ago, she had been on a train, full of nervous anticipation about meeting her fiancé. Now she was in a stranger's home, considering a marriage proposal that defied all convention and propriety. And yet, something about Mason Gray inspired trust. His offer, though shocking, seemed sincere. And this place, this beautiful, thriving ranch, spoke of a man who built things to last, who cared for what was his. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Abernathy entered, carrying a pitcher of water and fresh towels. "Thought you might want to freshen up before dinner," the older woman said, setting down her items. She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Gray told me about your situation, Miss Foster. I want you to know you're welcome here for as long as you need." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, touched by the kindness. "This is all rather unexpected." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened. "Life out here rarely goes as planned. Takes flexibility and courage to make it work." She paused. "Mr. Gray is a good man. Stubborn as the day is long, but good. And that child needs a mother's hand." "We've only just met," Elizabeth felt compelled to point out. "That's how it often happens out here," Mrs. Abernathy said matter-of-factly. "My own husband proposed 3 days after we met. We had 42 good years before he passed." With that, she left Elizabeth to her thoughts, which now seemed more jumbled than ever. Dinner that evening was a surprisingly pleasant affair. The food was simple but abundant: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Emma dominated the conversation, peppering Elizabeth with questions about Philadelphia, her teaching experience, and whether she knew how to ride a horse. "Not well," Elizabeth had admitted, to Emma's evident disappointment. After the meal, true to her word, Elizabeth read to Emma from a well-worn copy of The Swiss Family Robinson until the child's eyes grew heavy. As Emma drifted to sleep, Elizabeth gently tucked the blankets around her and turned to find Mason standing in the doorway, watching them with an unreadable expression. "She usually fights sleep like it's her sworn enemy," he said quietly as they stepped into the hallway. "You have a gift. All children love stories," Elizabeth replied. "It's hardly a special talent." "Maybe not," Mason conceded, "but your patience with her endless questions is. Most people find her exhausting." "She's curious," Elizabeth said. "That's a quality to be encouraged, not stifled." Mason studied her for a moment. "Would you join me on the porch?" "The evenings are the best time here." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. They walked downstairs in comfortable silence and out onto the wide porch where 2 rocking chairs faced the valley. The setting sun had painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, while the distant mountains were turning a deep purple. "It's breathtaking," Elizabeth murmured, settling into one of the chairs. "Never gets old," Mason agreed, taking the seat beside her, even after 8 years. They sat in silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. The air was filled with the gentle sounds of night, crickets chirping, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft creaking of their rocking chairs. "Why did you make such an outrageous proposal to a woman you just met?" Elizabeth finally asked, the question that had been burning in her mind all day. Mason didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. "When I saw you standing there on that platform, proud despite everything, something told me you were someone worth knowing." He paused. "I've learned to trust my instincts. They've rarely led me wrong." "That hardly explains a marriage proposal," Elizabeth pressed. Mason sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Emma needs a mother. I need a wife. Someone educated who can teach my daughter, help run this place, be a partner. And if I'm honest, the loneliness gets heavy sometimes." He glanced at her. "You needed a solution to an impossible situation. I offered one that could benefit us both." "Most men would have simply offered employment," Elizabeth pointed out. "I'm not most men," Mason replied with a slight smile. "And employment wouldn't give you the security or position that marriage would. Out here, a woman alone is vulnerable in ways that aren't fair but are real nonetheless." Elizabeth considered his words. There was a practical logic to them that she couldn't deny, however unconventional the proposal had been. "What if we find we can't abide each other?" she asked. "Then I keep my promise to take you back to town with money for a ticket east," Mason said simply. "But I think we might surprise ourselves." Elizabeth wasn't sure what to make of his confidence. "You seem very certain for a man who's known me less than a day." "Not certain," Mason corrected. "Hopeful. There's a difference." The quiet sincerity in his voice stirred something in Elizabeth, a responding hope she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "It's getting late," she said, rising from her chair. "Thank you for the evening." Mason stood as well. "Thank you for giving this a chance, Elizabeth." However, it turns out. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice followed her into her dreams that night. The next morning, Elizabeth woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the distant sounds of ranch life already in full swing. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses and made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Abernathy preparing breakfast. "Good morning," the housekeeper greeted her. "Sleep well?" "Surprisingly, yes," Elizabeth admitted. "Where is everyone?" "Mr. Gray's been up since dawn checking on a new calf. Emma's helping collect eggs. That child never sits still, if she can help it." As if summoned by her name, Emma burst through the door, a basket of eggs clutched carefully in her small hands. "Miss Foster! You're awake!" "Pa said I shouldn't disturb you, but now you're up. Can we start my lessons after breakfast?" Elizabeth smiled at the girl's enthusiasm. "I suppose we could. Though I'm not sure what your father has planned for the day." "Reading and numbers in the morning," came Mason's voice as he entered through the back door. "Then I thought you might like a tour of the ranch this afternoon." Elizabeth turned to find him watching her with that same quietly hopeful expression from the previous night. Despite herself, she felt a flutter of something warm in response. "That sounds lovely," she replied. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a horsewoman." "We'll take the wagon," Mason assured her with a smile that reached his eyes, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made Elizabeth's breath catch. No sense in risking our potential schoolteacher with a spirited mount on her second day. After breakfast, Elizabeth and Emma settled at the large table in what Mason called the study, a room lined with bookshelves and maps that served as his office and apparently now as a schoolroom. To Elizabeth's surprise, Emma proved to be an eager and quick student, already reading well above what might be expected for her age. "Your father must have been teaching you," Elizabeth commented as Emma correctly worked through a series of multiplication problems. Emma nodded. "Pa says learning is important, even for girls. Especially for girls. He says I can be anything I want when I grow up." Elizabeth raised her eyebrows, impressed by such progressive thinking from a frontier rancher. "And what do you want to be?" Emma's face grew serious with concentration. "A doctor, maybe? Or a rancher like Pa? Or possibly an explorer who discovers new places and animals?" "Those are all wonderful ambitions," Elizabeth said sincerely. "Mrs. Abernathy says I should want to be a lady and a mother," Emma confided. "But Pa says I can be a lady and still do important things." Elizabeth felt another surge of respect for Mason Gray. "Your father is right. Being a lady and doing important work aren't mutually exclusive." Emma frowned. "What does mutually exclusive mean?" "It means things that can't happen together," Elizabeth explained. "Like being completely dry and completely wet at the same time." Emma's face cleared with understanding. "So Pa is right. I can be a lady and a doctor?" "Absolutely," Elizabeth confirmed. "It might not be easy, but it's certainly possible." They continued with lessons until lunchtime, when Mrs. Abernathy called them to the kitchen for sandwiches and lemonade. Mason joined them, listening with evident pride, as Emma excitedly recounted everything she had learned that morning. "She's a natural scholar," Elizabeth told him. "You've laid an excellent foundation." "I've done my best," Mason replied. "But there's much I don't know how to teach her." After lunch, true to his word, Mason took Elizabeth on a tour of the ranch. From the comfort of the wagon, she saw the extent of his holdings, the grazing lands where cattle fattened on rich grass, the hay fields that would feed them through winter, the creek that provided water year-round, the pine forest that supplied lumber for buildings and firewood. "You've built something remarkable here," Elizabeth said, as they paused on a hilltop overlooking the property. "All this from a poker game?" Mason smiled. "The land? Yes. The rest came from hard work and no small amount of luck." He glanced at her. "What about you? What brought you to teaching?" Elizabeth considered the question. "Necessity, initially. My father was a professor who lost everything in bad investments. When he died, teaching was one of the few respectable options available to me, but I grew to love it." "And what brought you to Harold Williams's correspondence?" Mason asked, his tone careful. Elizabeth sighed. "More necessity, I'm afraid. The school where I taught was closing. At 32, with no family and dwindling prospects." She trailed off. embarrassed by the vulnerability of her admission. "You took a chance," Mason finished for her. "There's no shame in that." "Perhaps not," Elizabeth agreed, "but there's certainly foolishness in believing the pretty lies a stranger writes in letters." "Some strangers are more honest than others," Mason said quietly, his green eyes meeting hers. Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks and looked away, disconcerted by the effect his direct gaze had on her composure. "We should head back. Emma will be wondering where we are." As Mason turned the wagon toward home, Elizabeth found herself wondering what it would be like to call this place home permanently, to wake each morning to the beauty of these mountains, to watch Emma grow into the remarkable woman she promised to become, to share quiet evening conversations with Mason on the porch as the stars emerged. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. How could she contemplate tying her life to a man she had known for barely a day? And yet, something about Mason Gray and his daughter, about this place and the life they led here, called to something deep within her, a longing for belonging she had never fully acknowledged. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard. "Does this mean I get a new dress for the wedding?" Elizabeth laughed, relieved by the practical turn of the conversation. "I think that could be arranged." "Where is your father?" she asked, realizing Mason wasn't in the kitchen. "Checking the damage," Mrs. Abernathy answered. "Said to tell you he'd be back for breakfast." As if summoned by her words, the back door opened, and Mason entered, bringing with him the fresh scent of rain-washed air. He paused when he saw Elizabeth, a smile spreading across his face that held no trace of the previous day's exhaustion. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm with meaning that wasn't lost on Elizabeth. "Good morning," she replied, aware of Mrs. Abernathy's knowing look, and Emma's curious gaze darting between them. "The creek's dropping," Mason reported, moving to wash his hands at the sink. "Road should be passable by tomorrow or the next day. And then we can go to town and get married," Emma announced, causing Mason to nearly drop the towel he was using. "I see the news has traveled," Elizabeth said dryly. Mason had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I thought it best to prepare her," he explained, "in case you changed your mind." "Well, I haven't," Elizabeth assured him, "though I would appreciate being included in such discussions in the future." "Noted," Mason agreed, a spark of admiration in his eyes at her directness. And agreed. Over breakfast, they discussed practical matters: when to go to town, what arrangements needed to be made, how to announce their news to the community. Elizabeth was impressed by Mason's thoughtfulness. He had clearly been considering these details for longer than just the past 12 hours. "Judge Parker can perform the ceremony," he explained, "and Mrs. Wilson has rooms above her dress shop where you can stay the night before, if you'd prefer to follow that tradition." "You've thought this through," Elizabeth observed. Mason's expression turned slightly sheepish. "I may have been planning this since I first saw you on that platform." "You were that certain?" Elizabeth asked, genuinely surprised. "Not certain," Mason corrected. "Hopeful. There's a difference." The echo of his words from their earlier conversation warmed Elizabeth's heart. This man's honesty was refreshing. He acknowledged his hopes without presuming her agreement, recognized his attraction without assuming reciprocation. After breakfast, Mason suggested they take advantage of the break in the weather to show Elizabeth more of the ranch, specifically, a place he thought she might enjoy seeing. They set off on foot, with Emma skipping ahead of them along a path that wound up into the hills behind the house. "Where are we going?" Elizabeth asked as they walked side by side, close enough that their hands occasionally brushed, sending small shivers of awareness through her each time. "There's a spot up here that's special to me," Mason replied. "I thought you might like to see it before you completely commit to this decision." The path grew steeper, cutting through a grove of aspen trees whose leaves glittered silver green in the morning light. When they emerged from the trees, Elizabeth gasped at the view that greeted them. They stood on a small plateau that overlooked not just the Double G Ranch, but the entire valley. The creek, still swollen with rain, wound like a silver ribbon through the landscape. The distant mountains stood crisp and clear against the washed blue of the sky. And spread below them was the ranch, The house, the barn, the corrals, the fields, all looking somehow more substantial, more permanent from this vantage point. "It's breathtaking," Elizabeth said softly. "This is where I decided to build the house," Mason explained. "I came up here my first week on the property and knew this was where I wanted to make my home, where I could see everything that mattered." "I understand why," Elizabeth replied, genuinely moved by the beauty of the spot and what it represented. "You can see your whole world from here." "Not quite my whole world," Mason said, turning to look at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Not anymore." Emma, who had been exploring nearby, suddenly called out, "Pa, look what I found!" She held up a small blue wildflower, one of the first blooms of spring. "That's a blue flax," Mason told her. "They're hardy. Come back year after year, no matter how harsh the winter was." "Like us," Emma said with the simple wisdom of childhood. "We keep going no matter what." Mason's hand found Elizabeth's, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Yes," he agreed, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. "Like us." In that moment, standing on the hilltop with Mason's hand warm in hers and Emma's bright face turned expectantly toward them, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right decision. This was where she belonged. Not because circumstances had forced her here, but because something deeper, something she hadn't even known she was seeking, had found its home. The abandoned bride from the train station had found not just shelter, but purpose. Not just a husband, but a partner. Not just a roof, but a home. And in the days to come, as the waters receded and life resumed its normal patterns, she would begin the journey of becoming not just Elizabeth Foster, but Elizabeth Gray, wife, mother, and mistress of Double G Ranch. 3 days later, the road to Cedar Ridge was finally passable. Elizabeth stood in the bedroom that had become hers, carefully packing the few belongings she would take to town. According to the plan she and Mason had agreed upon, she would stay at Mrs. Wilson's rooms above the dress shop the night before their wedding, while Mason and Emma stayed with his friend, the town blacksmith. A nod to tradition, Mason had explained with a smile that told her he found the arrangement as unnecessary as she did, but was willing to observe the formalities for the town's sake. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Emma or Mrs. Abernathy. Instead, Mason entered, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Almost ready?" he asked, glancing at her nearly packed valise. "Nearly," Elizabeth confirmed. "Is the wagon prepared?" "Waiting in the yard," Mason replied, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he closed the door behind him and took a step toward her. "Elizabeth, before we go to town and everything becomes official, there's something I need to say." A flutter of anxiety rose in Elizabeth's chest. "That sounds ominous." Mason shook his head quickly. "No, nothing like that. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of emotional discomfort. "I want you to know that this isn't just a practical arrangement for me. Not anymore. Maybe it never was." Elizabeth set down the blouse she had been folding. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when I saw you standing at that station, so proud even in your distress, something happened to me that I can't quite explain." Mason's green eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I told myself I was offering you a solution, offering Emma a mother. But the truth is more selfish than that." "Selfish?" Elizabeth echoed, confused. Mason took another step toward her. "I wanted you here, with me, from that first moment." He gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. "It sounds mad, I know, but there it is. The truth I thought you should have before you bind your life to mine." Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. At the vulnerability it must have cost this proud, self-sufficient man to admit such feelings. "It doesn't sound mad," she said softly. "Impulsive, perhaps. Unconventional, certainly. But not mad." "You're not alarmed?" Mason asked, his brow furrowed. Elizabeth smiled, stepping closer to him. "Should I be alarmed that the man I'm about to marry finds me attractive? that he wanted me from the beginning, rather than simply pitying my circumstances. Mason's expression cleared, relief evident in the set of his shoulders. When you put it that way. Besides, Elizabeth continued, emboldened by his confession, I would be a hypocrite to judge your impulses when I've acted just as rashly, agreeing to marry a man I barely knew because something about him called to something in me that I didn't even know was waiting to be awakened. Mason's eyes darkened at her words, and he closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming to rest lightly on her waist. And what was that something, Elizabeth? She placed her palms against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. A recognition, perhaps, as if some part of me already knew you, already belonged with you, before we ever spoke a word. Mason's smile was slow and filled with wonder. I've spent my life believing that practical considerations should guide a man's choices, that emotions were luxuries a rancher with responsibilities couldn't afford. His hand rose to cup her cheek. You've proven me wrong in the most unexpected way. Perhaps practical considerations and matters of the heart aren't as separate as you believed, Elizabeth suggested, leaning slightly into his touch. Perhaps not, Mason agreed, his gaze dropping to her lips. The kiss that followed was different from their previous ones, deeper, more certain, filled with a promise that made Elizabeth's knees weak and her pulse race. Mason's arms tightened around her waist, drawing her closer until she could feel the solid warmth of him against her. Her hands slid up his chest to his shoulders, then to the nape of his neck where her fingers tangled in his hair. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. If we don't leave for town soon, I may be tempted to suggest we dispense with the formal ceremony altogether. Elizabeth laughed softly, though the thought held more appeal than she would have expected a week ago. Emma would be disappointed to miss her new dress. A compelling argument, Mason conceded with a smile, reluctantly stepping back. I'll wait for you downstairs. After he left, Elizabeth stood for a moment, her fingers pressed to lips that still tingled from his kiss. How extraordinary that in the space of less than a week her life had transformed so completely. From the desperate, abandoned bride to a woman on the verge of a marriage that promised both security and, most unexpectedly, happiness. The journey to Cedar Ridge took longer than usual due to the muddy conditions of the road, but by mid-afternoon, their wagon was rolling down the main street of the small frontier town. Elizabeth couldn't help but note the contrast between her arrival now and her arrival less than a week ago. Then, alone and abandoned, now, seated beside the man who would soon be her husband, with his daughter chattering excitedly between them. They stopped first at Judge Parker's office to make arrangements for the ceremony, set for noon the following day. The judge, a dignified older man with kind eyes, offered his congratulations with a warmth that suggested he thought Mason had made an excellent choice. About time this fellow settled down properly, he told Elizabeth with a conspiratorial wink. The most eligible bachelor in the county, but too busy with that ranch to court anyone properly. Until now, Mason said, his hand finding Elizabeth's in a gesture that felt both protective and proud. Their next stop was Mrs. Wilson's dress shop, where Emma was fitted for a new dress while Elizabeth selected a simple but elegant blue dress for her wedding. Though not traditional white, the color complemented her eyes and was practical enough to be worn again for Sunday services and special occasions, a consideration that the practical rancher's wife and her appreciated. "You look beautiful, Miss Foster," Emma declared when Elizabeth emerged from the fitting room. "Like a queen in a story." "Thank you, Emma," Elizabeth replied, touched by the child's enthusiasm. "But soon you'll need to call me something else. What would you prefer?" "Mrs. Gray seems very formal between us." Emma's forehead wrinkled in thought. "Could I call you Mother? Or is that too soon?" Elizabeth knelt to bring herself to eye level with the child, her heart full. "If that's what you'd like, I would be honored, but only when you're ready." "I think I'm ready now," Emma decided with the straightforward certainty of childhood. "I've been practicing saying it in my head." Elizabeth blinked back unexpected tears, aware of Mason watching them with an expression of such tenderness it nearly undid her composure entirely. "Then Mother it is," she managed. After completing their purchases, Mason reluctantly left them at Mrs. Wilson's, heading to the blacksmith's where he would spend the night. "Until tomorrow," he said softly to Elizabeth, squeezing her hand in a gesture that conveyed far more than words could have done. That evening, after Emma had been collected by Mrs. Abernathy, who would stay with her at the blacksmith's house, Elizabeth found herself alone for the first time in days. Mrs. Wilson had prepared a simple but comfortable room for her, and after a light supper, Elizabeth sat by the window overlooking the main street of Cedar Ridge. The town was quiet at this hour, with only a few patrons entering and leaving the saloon down the street. Lamps glowed in windows, and somewhere a piano played a gentle melody. It was a peaceful scene, so different from the bustling streets of Philadelphia she had known all her life. Would she miss the city, the cultural events, the libraries, the stimulating conversations with fellow teachers? Perhaps, but as she watched a young couple stroll arm in arm beneath the newly installed street lamps, she realized that this small frontier town offered its own kind of richness, a community where people knew and cared for one another, where her presence would be noted and, hopefully, valued. And beyond the town lay the Double G, with its breathtaking vistas and demanding but rewarding life. A place where she could build something meaningful alongside a man whose strength and gentleness had captured her heart with unexpected swiftness. A knock at her door interrupted her reflections. She opened it to find Harold Williams, the very man who had abandoned her at the station, standing in the hallway, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "Miss Foster," he began, removing his hat. "I heard you were in town. May I have a word?" Elizabeth's initial impulse was to shut the door in his face, but curiosity overcame indignation. "What could you possibly have to say to me, Mr. Williams?" He shifted uncomfortably. "May I come in? This isn't a conversation for a hallway." After a moment's hesitation, Elizabeth stepped aside, leaving the door pointedly open. "You have 5 minutes." Harold entered, turning his hat nervously in his hands. He was a slight man with receding brown hair and unremarkable features, nothing like the dashing figure his letters had led her to imagine. "I came to apologize," he said, not meeting her eyes. "My behavior was inexcusable." "Yes, it was," Elizabeth agreed coolly. "You could have simply written to break our engagement, rather than allowing me to travel all this way." Harold flushed. "I know. I lost my nerve when I saw your age. The photograph you sent must have been taken some years ago, and And you expected a younger bride?" Elizabeth finished for him. "Someone more tractable, perhaps? More desperate?" "That's not fair," Harold protested weakly. "Isn't it?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Your letters spoke of wanting a companion, an educated woman to share your life. Were those words sincere, or were you simply looking for someone to cook your meals and warm your bed?" Harold's blush deepened. "I meant what I wrote. But when I saw you, you seemed so formidable. Not at all what I had imagined." Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh at this description. "Formidable? Is that what frightened you away? That I might have opinions of my own?" "You're twisting my words," Harold complained. "And you wasted months of my life with false promises," Elizabeth countered. "But as it happens, I should thank you." "Thank me?" Harold looked genuinely confused. "If you hadn't abandoned me at that station, I would never have met Mason Gray," Elizabeth explained. "And I would have married a man who could be frightened away by the simple fact of a woman being, quote, formidable. So yes, Mr. Williams, I thank you for your cowardice. It spared us both what would have been a disastrous marriage." Harold stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without producing words. Finally, he managed. "You're marrying Gray? After less than a week?" "Tomorrow," Elizabeth confirmed. "And before you express concern for my welfare, let me assure you that Mason Gray has shown me more honesty, respect, and genuine regard in 6 days than you managed in 8 months of correspondence." Something like envy flashed across Harold's face. I wish you happiness, then." "Your 5 minutes are up, Mr. Williams," Elizabeth said, moving toward the door. "I suggest you leave before my fiancé comes looking for me. He's considerably less forgiving of your behavior than I am." After Harold departed, Elizabeth closed the door and leaned against it, surprised to find herself smiling. The confrontation, rather than upsetting her, had only confirmed the rightness of her decision. Harold Williams, with his half-hearted apology and transparent self-interest, could not have been more different from Mason Gray if he had tried. The contrast was almost comical. One man who had fled at the first sign that she might be more than he could easily control, and another who valued precisely those qualities of independence and strength that had frightened Harold away. One who had abandoned her without a second thought, and another who had seen her value instantly and moved heaven and earth to make her his own. Elizabeth slept soundly that night, untroubled by doubts or second thoughts. When morning came, bringing with it the day of her wedding, she woke with a sense of quiet certainty that carried her through her preparations. Mrs. Wilson helped her dress, arranging her hair in a simple but elegant style adorned with small white flowers from the shopkeeper's garden. "You make a beautiful bride, Miss Foster," the older woman said, stepping back to admire her work. "And if you don't mind my saying so, a much better match for Mason Gray than poor Clara ever was." "You knew his first wife?" Elizabeth asked, surprised. Mrs. Wilson nodded. The whole town did. Pretty little thing, but city-bred and unhappy from the moment she arrived. Never adapted to ranch life. Always dreaming of returning to Denver. She patted Elizabeth's hand. "You're made of sturdier stuff, I think. The kind that bends but doesn't break when the winds blow hard." "I hope so," Elizabeth replied, touched by the woman's assessment. "Mason thinks so, too," Mrs. Wilson said confidently. "I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Not even Clara, God rest her soul. The simple ceremony took place in Judge Parker's office, witnessed by Mrs. Abernathy, the blacksmith and his wife, and several other townspeople who had come to see the mysterious Eastern woman who had captured Mason Gray's heart so unexpectedly. Emma, resplendent in her new dress, stood proudly at her father's side, her small face solemn with the importance of the occasion. When the judge asked who gave this woman in marriage, it was Emma who stepped forward and declared, "I do, Your Honor. She's going to be my mother now." A ripple of laughter and approving murmurs went through the small gathering, and even the judge's dignified demeanor cracked into a smile. "Well then, with such a fervent endorsement, how can I refuse?" The vows were simple and traditional, but as Elizabeth repeated the ancient promises, she infused each word with her own private meaning, to love this man who had found her at her lowest moment and seen in her not an object of pity, but a partner worthy of respect. To honor him for his integrity, his devotion to his daughter, his quiet strength. To cherish the life they would build together on the foundation of mutual regard that had grown between them with such unexpected swiftness. When Mason slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, "It was my grandmother's," he had explained earlier, and the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a mantle. This was where she belonged, not because fate or desperation had driven her here, but because she had made a choice. An unconventional, shocking choice by the standards of her former life, but one that promised fulfillment beyond anything she had dared to imagine a week ago. The small reception at the hotel dining room was a joyful affair, with the townsfolk welcoming Elizabeth warmly into their community. She was introduced to so many people that their names and faces began to blur together, but she was touched by the genuine goodwill that seemed to surround them. "They approve of you," Mason murmured in her ear as they accepted congratulations from the bank manager and his wife. "Not that I needed their approval, but it's nice to have it nonetheless." "I'm glad," Elizabeth replied sincerely. "I want to be a part of this community, not just an outsider who married into it." "You won't be an outsider for long," Mason predicted. "Not with your natural ability to connect with people. Besides, we need a teacher for the town school. Judge Parker mentioned it earlier, said the position has been vacant for months." Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. "You wouldn't mind if I taught? It wouldn't interfere with my duties at the ranch?" "Mind?" Mason's expression was one of genuine confusion. "Elizabeth, your education and experience as a teacher are part of what makes you so valuable. Not just to Emma and me, but to the entire community. I'd never ask you to set that aside." Once again, Elizabeth was struck by how fortunate she had been in finding this man, a frontier rancher with views more progressive than many educated men of her acquaintance in Philadelphia. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand all that the words encompassed. As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth found herself in conversation with Dr. Matthews, the town's elderly physician. "Glad to meet you, Mrs. Gray," he said, his rheumy eyes kind behind thick spectacles. "Always good to have another educated person in these parts." "You're too kind," Elizabeth replied. "I understand you delivered Emma?" "Tried to," the doctor corrected soberly. "Arrived too late to save her mother, I'm afraid. Difficult birth, and the blizzard delayed me." He shook his head at the memory. "Mason never blamed me, though he had every right to. That's the kind of man you've married. One who understands that some things are beyond human control." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "I believe he does understand that." "He also understands what matters," Dr. Matthews continued. "Stayed by that baby's side day and night until we were sure she'd live. Never seen such devotion from a new father, especially one grieving a wife." Elizabeth's heart swelled with love for the man who had become her husband. Each new story she heard only confirmed the essential goodness of his character, the depth of his capacity for love and loyalty. By late afternoon, Mason approached her with Emma in tow. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Gray?" he asked, the new name rolling off his tongue with evident pleasure. Home. How quickly that word had come to me in the Double G Ranch, rather than the narrow boarding house room in Philadelphia. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, matching his smile with her own. "I'm ready." The ride back to the ranch was filled with Emma's excited chatter about the wedding, the new dress, and the cake Mrs. Wilson had baked for the occasion. As they approached the property, the setting sun gilded the landscape, turning the ordinary into something magical. "Welcome home, Elizabeth Gray," Mason said softly as the house came into view. "Thank you, husband," she replied, testing the word and finding it felt right on her lips. "It's good to be home." Mrs. Abernathy had prepared a special dinner for their return, after which Emma, exhausted by the excitement of the day, was easily persuaded to bed. The child insisted that both her father and new mother participate in her bedtime ritual, a request they happily obliged. "I have a family now," Emma said drowsily as Elizabeth tucked the blankets around her. "A real one, like in the stories." "Yes, you do," Elizabeth assured her, smoothing a curl from the child's forehead. "And we'll write our own story together, day by day." "Will it have a happy ending?" Emma asked, her eyes already drifting closed. "I believe it will," Elizabeth replied, meeting Mason's gaze over their daughter's bed. "The very happiest." Later, as they stood together on the porch watching the stars emerge in the velvet darkness of the prairie sky, Mason's arm slipped around Elizabeth's waist, drawing her against his side. "Having regrets?" he asked, only half joking. Elizabeth turned in his embrace to face him. "Not one," she said firmly. "Though I admit, if anyone had told me a week ago that I would be standing here as your wife, I would have thought them mad." Mason chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her where their bodies touched. "Life has a way of surprising us, sometimes for the worse, but occasionally, very occasionally, for the infinitely better." "Infinitely better," Elizabeth agreed, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "That describes this particular surprise perfectly." Mason's arms tightened around her, his kiss deepening with a hunger that sent heat coursing through her veins. When they finally parted, both breathless, his eyes had darkened to the color of forest shadows. "I meant what I said before," he murmured, his voice rough with restrained desire. "I don't expect. That is, I understand if you need time before we—" Elizabeth pressed her fingers gently to his lips, silencing his considerate speech. "Mason Gray," she said softly, "take me to bed. I may have been an abandoned bride a week ago, but tonight I am very much a willing wife." The look that transformed his features, relief, joy, and naked want all mingled together, was one Elizabeth knew she would remember until her dying day. Without another word, Mason swept her into his arms and carried her into the house, up the stairs, and into the bedroom that they would now share as husband and wife. And there, in the tender darkness of their wedding night, Elizabeth discovered yet another dimension to the extraordinary man she had married, a lover both passionate and gentle, who made her feel cherished and desired in equal measure. A man who had seen her value when another had discarded her, who had offered her not just a home and security, but a love she had never dared to dream might be hers. The two-old bride abandoned at the station had found not just shelter in Mason Gray's impulsive proposal, but the beginning of a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. A testament to the truth that sometimes what appears to be our darkest moment is merely the prelude to our greatest joy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.